It is the spring of 1943, and somewhere beneath the grey heaving swells of the North Atlantic, a German U-boat moves in silence. The crew, perhaps 40 men crammed into a steel cylinder no wider than a terraced house is long, go about their routines with the mechanical precision of men who have done this many times before. They check gauges, rotate watches, eat their meals in shifts, and try not to think too hard about the ocean pressing against every weld and rivet around them. The boat is their world. Everything they wear, everything they touch, every inch of fabric against their skin has passed through the same supply chain, loaded aboard at port, stowed in lockers and hammocks and kit bags before the hatches sealed shut and the sea closed over them. What none of them know is that somewhere in the fabric of their clothing, worked invisibly into the weave of their uniforms and undergarments, something is waiting. It has no color, it has no smell. It produces no immediate sensation whatsoever. But within hours of sustained skin contact, it will begin to work. And when it does, there will be no ignoring it, no reasoning with it, no professional discipline strong enough to override what the human body does when every nerve ending from collar to waistband screams at once. This is not a story about bombs or bullets. It is not a story about radar or code breaking or the rolling industrial might of the Allied war machine. It is a story about itching powder, about a small team of extraordinarily inventive and occasionally gleefully unhinged British scientists who decided that the way to fight the most feared naval weapon in the German arsenal was not with depth charges alone, but with the systematic destruction of a submarine crew's ability to function, concentrate, or keep their hands away from their own bodies long enough to do their jobs. And it worked. On at least one recorded occasion, it worked so comprehensively that the crew did something no depth charge had managed to make them do. They surfaced, they abandoned their vessel, and they scuttled it themselves. To understand why this was even considered a viable strategy, let alone why it succeeded, you have to understand the position Britain found itself in during the early years of the war at sea. The U-boat was not merely an inconvenience. It was, for a period between 1940 and 1943, an existential threat of the most direct and immediate kind. Britain imports the overwhelming majority of its food, its fuel, its raw materials, and its military supplies. The sea lanes of the Atlantic were not a matter of strategic preference. They were a lifeline, and the Germans knew it. Admiral Karl Dönitz had built his entire philosophy of submarine warfare around this single vulnerability. His U-boats did not need to sink warships to win the war. They needed only to sink enough merchant vessels, steadily, persistently, across enough months to starve the island into submission. And for a time, they came terrifyingly close to achieving exactly that. In 1942, alone, German submarines sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The figures for individual months in the spring of that year were catastrophic. In March 1943, in a period that naval historians sometimes refer to as Black March, U-boats sank nearly 500,000 tons of shipping in a single month. The maths were stark. Ships were being sunk faster than they could be built. Crews were dying faster than they could be trained. The convoy system, the primary Allied response, was struggling to protect enough vessels to keep Britain supplied. Against this backdrop, the British were willing to consider almost anything. The official channels were doing their part. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment were refining airborne radar. Bletchley Park was wrestling with Enigma. Shipyards were working around the clock. But in the shadow of all of this, in offices and workshops that did not officially exist, a separate war was being planned. Not a war of attrition fought in tonnage and armor plate, but a war fought in the gaps, in the supply chains, in the psychology of men who spent weeks at a time in sealed metal tubes beneath the ocean. The organization responsible for exploring these gaps was the Special Operations Executive, and among its more unusual projects was a sustained and serious effort to make life aboard a German submarine physically, psychologically, and dermatologically unbearable. The facility at Station 9, housed at the Fryth, a former hotel near Welwyn in Hertfordshire, was the SOE's primary research and development establishment. It operated under official cover as a water research station, which told curious locals absolutely nothing about what was actually happening inside. The scientists who worked there were a deliberately eclectic mix: chemists, biologists, engineers, and several individuals whose precise professional classification resisted easy description. They were tasked not with building conventional weapons, but with finding unconventional ways to impede, disrupt, demoralize, and occasionally embarrass enemy forces. They designed explosives disguised as lumps of coal, incendiary devices built into fountain pens, and poisons concealed in everything from cigarettes to rat droppings. They were, by any reasonable assessment, peculiar people doing peculiar things, and they were very good at it. The itching powder program emerged from a deceptively simple observation. A U-boat crew was a closed system. Once at sea, the men could not obtain new clothing. They could not shower with any regularity. They could not seek medical attention beyond what their own boat carried. If something was wrong with their clothing when they left port, it would still be wrong with their clothing 6 weeks later, and there was nothing they could do about it except endure. The question the SOE scientists asked was whether this closed system could be exploited, whether something could be introduced into the supply chain before the boat left harbour that would degrade the crew's effectiveness across the entire patrol. The answer, they concluded, was yes, and the mechanism was roses. The active compound in the SOE's itching powder formulation was derived from the seed casings of Rosa canina, the common dog rose, and more precisely from the fine silica-based microfilaments found on the seeds within those casings. These filaments, each one invisible to the naked eye, are shaped rather like tiny harpoons. Under magnification, they resemble a barbed fishing hook at roughly 100 times smaller than a human hair. When they make contact with skin, they do not simply rest on the surface, they penetrate the outer layers of the epidermis and, through normal movement and friction, work themselves progressively deeper. The body's inflammatory response to this intrusion is immediate and, crucially, self-reinforcing. Scratching drives the filaments further in. Warmth and sweat accelerate absorption. Tight clothing, the kind that does not move freely against skin, creates the worst possible conditions because the microfilaments are constantly being ground against the dermis, without the temporary relief of being brushed away. The SOE's chemists did not invent this irritant. Rose hip seeds had been used as a schoolboy prank in Britain for generations, stuffed down shirt collars as a crude joke known as itching powder. What the scientists at the Fryth did was refine it to a degree that transformed a playground nuisance into a strategic weapon. They developed processes to isolate and concentrate the active filaments, removing organic material that might degrade over time or produce a detectable smell. They experimented extensively with particle size, finding that filaments ground to a specific diameter produced the most persistent irritation while remaining invisible to inspection. They tested delivery mechanisms, including ways to work the compound into fabric during laundering so that it was distributed evenly throughout a garment and could not be removed by simple shaking or brushing. The finished product was odourless, colourless, stable at room temperature, and effective at concentrations low enough to be undetectable without laboratory analysis. A garment treated with it looked, smelled, and felt entirely normal until it had been worn for several hours. The operational challenge was getting the material into the German naval laundry system. U-boat crews, like all military personnel, did not launder their own clothes during shore leave. Their uniforms and undergarments were collected, cleaned, and return through a centralized supply system, operating out of the bases at Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle on the French Atlantic coast. These bases were the arteries of the U-boat campaign. Boats came in, were serviced, refueled, rearmed, and reprovisioned. Crews rested, were debriefed, and prepared for the next patrol. Everything moved through identifiable documented channels, which meant that with the right intelligence and the right network of agents in occupied France, those channels could theoretically be accessed. The SOE had exactly such networks, and through them treated clothing made its way into the laundry supply at several of the Atlantic bases. The precise methods are not fully documented in declassified records, but the broad approach is understood. Local agents, French civilians working in or adjacent to the base facilities, were supplied with quantities of the refined compound and instructions for its application. In at least some cases, treated uniforms were introduced directly into the laundry cycle. In others, the powder was applied to clothing already in the system. The scale of the operation is not precisely known. Estimates suggest that treated garments reached somewhere between a dozen and several dozen U-boats during the program's most active period in 1942 and 1943, though records remain classified or were destroyed before the war's end. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The documented effects of the program were, depending on your perspective, either darkly comic or genuinely impressive. A crew rendered unable to concentrate by persistent, escalating dermatological irritation is a crew that makes errors in navigation, errors in hydrophone interpretation, errors in the calculation of attack angles and torpedo settings. A watch officer who cannot stop scratching his neck long enough to read a bearing properly is not an effective watch officer. A commander who has been awake for 30 hours because the material of his bunk covers has turned his torso into a single, continuous source of torment is not in the best condition to make the split-second decisions that submarine warfare demands. The physical symptoms of sustained exposure to the compound were described in later accounts as a burning, prickling, crawling sensation that intensified with warmth and activity. In the confined heat of a submarine running submerged, where temperatures routinely exceeded 30 degrees Celsius, conditions were ideal for maximum effect. The single most dramatic and widely cited outcome of the program occurred by most accounts in 1943. A U-boat, the specific designation of which does not appear in the declassified documentation available, reportedly surfaced unexpectedly in the Atlantic, and its crew scuttled the vessel. The explanation that emerged through intelligence channels was that the crew had been so thoroughly incapacitated by the irritant that the commander had judged the boat no longer capable of effective operation. Whether the crew had correctly identified the source of their suffering, or whether they believed they had encountered some form of chemical contamination, is not recorded. What is recorded is that the boat went to the bottom by the crew's own hand, and the men were recovered as prisoners of war. The scuttling of a U-boat by its own crew, outside of the standard procedure for preventing capture, was sufficiently unusual to attract attention from naval intelligence. German attempts to produce their own version of unconventional disruption warfare were, by comparison, considerably less sophisticated in this particular domain. The Wehrmacht's chemical warfare program was substantial and technically advanced, but it was oriented toward offensive mass casualty agents rather than targeted, covert harassment compounds. The Germans had developed highly effective irritants for conventional weapons delivery, including arsenical compounds and vesicants, far more dangerous than anything the SOE was deploying. But the concept of infiltrating a closed military supply chain with a persistent, sublethal, deniable irritant was not an area they prioritized or, as far as available records suggest, ever successfully replicated. The American Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was aware of the British itching powder program and expressed interest in adapting it for their own operations in the Pacific Theatre. The OSS procurement files from 1943 include references to requests for samples and technical documentation from Station 9. Whether American versions of the compound were ever operationally deployed against Japanese forces is not confirmed in publicly available records, though the OSS certainly investigated the concept seriously. The British program was, in this respect, genuinely pioneering. The idea of weaponizing a supply chain through targeted chemical contamination of personal items, rather than food or water, was an approach that required a particular combination of botanical knowledge, chemical engineering skill, and institutional willingness to think outside every conventional category. The Fryth provided all three. In terms of direct material impact, the itching powder program was never going to be the decisive factor in the Battle of the Atlantic. That battle was won and lost through developments in airborne radar, the closing of the Atlantic air gap, improved convoy tactics, and the gradual cracking of the Enigma settings that Dönitz used to direct his boats. By May 1943, the month that naval historians call Black May, the Germans lost 41 U-boats in a single month. Dönitz temporarily withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic. The crisis, though it was not immediately apparent to those living through it, had passed its peak. But the itching powder operation mattered in ways that go beyond direct body counts and tonnage figures. It demonstrated, with some success, that a small creative team operating without significant resources could achieve disproportionate effects by targeting the human element of an enemy weapon system, rather than the weapon itself. A U-boat was a marvel of engineering. It could withstand depth charges, evade destroyers, and traverse the ocean submerged for weeks at a time. It could not protect its crew from their own clothing. The vulnerability that the SOE exploited was not a flaw in the engineering, it was a flaw in the assumption that a closed system is a secure one. The legacy of the program can be traced in subsequent thinking about disruption operations and supply chain vulnerability. The concept of what military planners would later call area denial through contamination, the idea that a theatre or a supply system could be made hostile without conventional weapons, owes something to the work done in Hertfordshire in 1942 and 1943. Modern thinking about supply chain security, particularly in military logistics, explicitly accounts for the possibility of hostile interference at the level of individual items of clothing, rations, and personal equipment, a concern that did not receive systematic attention before the Second World War demonstrated that it was a real and exploitable vulnerability. Physical evidence of the program is sparse. The Fryth itself survives, converted long since to a conference center, its wartime history marked by a modest plaque that gives little indication of what went on inside. Some samples of the refined compound and related documentation are held in private collections and in portions of the National Archives that remain restricted. The program did not produce the kind of dramatic hardware that ends up in the Imperial War Museum. It produced nothing you could put behind glass. What it produced was discomfort, confusion, degraded performance, and in at least one case, the entirely voluntary sinking of a German submarine by the men who served aboard her. Return for a moment to that U-boat in the North Atlantic in 1943. The gauges still read, the engines still turn. The torpedo tubes are loaded and functional. Every system that engineering and industrial production could provide is in perfect working order, but the men operating those systems have not slept properly in 4 days. Every watch rotation brings the same inescapable torment. The cook cannot concentrate long enough to remember what he has already added to the pot. The hydrophone operator pulls at his collar every 40 seconds, a gesture that has become involuntary, that he no longer even notices himself making. but that degrades his ability to hold a sound picture in his mind long enough to report it accurately. The commander has scratched his forearms raw through his uniform sleeves. He has run through every explanation he can think of. Bad food, contaminated water supply, some kind of outbreak. He does not know what is happening to his crew, and not knowing makes it worse. At some point, he makes a decision. The boat surfaces. The hatch is open. Cold Atlantic air floods in, and for a moment, the relief is extraordinary. The crew, blinking in the grey light, begin the process of abandoning their vessel. And somewhere in the operations rooms of the SOE, or perhaps in the intelligence report that will eventually make its way back to Welwyn, someone reads the account of an unexplained scuttling in the North Atlantic and permits themselves a quiet, professional satisfaction. A German submarine, bristling with torpedoes and crewed by experienced men, had been sent to the bottom not by a destroyer or an aircraft or a depth charge. It had been sent to the bottom by rose seeds, by an invisible barbed filament, refined in a commandeered hotel in Hertfordshire, sewn into a uniform in occupied France, and worn by men who never knew what had been done to them until it was already too late. In the long and remarkable history of British wartime ingenuity, few weapons were stranger, few delivery mechanisms more elegant, and few outcomes more perfectly suited to the peculiar institutional character of the people who devised it. The U-boat was the terror of the Atlantic, and it turned out that what it could not survive was the simple, ancient, unglamorous irritation of itching powder, applied with patience, precision, and a very particular kind of British imagination.